fringe meeting organised by the Kurdish Assembly and Kurdish Progress titled Kurdistan, Self-Determination, Freedom and Democracy. I imagine, and I feel like a lot of you here today are already here because you're quite aware of the situation that faces the Kurdish people and also the peoples of the Middle East in general. And particularly, I imagine and I hope that we're all here today to get a bit more of a clearer understanding about what we can all do individually, but also together. So, just a little bit about the Kurdish Assembly. The Kurdish Assembly, as a UK-wide assembly, was established a few years ago, but the Kurdish communities across the UK have been organising, mobilising, and fighting for democracy, peace, and justice for the entire time they have also been in the UK, so particularly since the 80s and more heavily since the 90s. I am proud to be a part of a tradition that has taught me as well that it's really crucial to never ever let go of the fight for a just democracy, peace, that is underpinned by freedom. So I want to thank all of our guests here today for joining us, and I very much look forward to all the contributions. I don't want to talk too much about the situation. I might make some comments in between, but obviously we're also here to hear from our amazing guests who are supporters. I want to say a special thank you to Jan Furman, who has come here today from Brussels, who there is not much of an introduction needed, but is a Belgian lawyer who won a very crucial case that he will be talking about today, and we hope for it to inform some of the work we have been doing today, which I imagine Lloyd will talk about, particularly within the framework of the APPG of Kurdistan in Turkey and Syria. But yeah, I would like to thank Bambos, Kim, again Jan, Lloyd, Simon and Kate for being here today, and I very much look forward to their contributions. But I want to kick off with Lloyd, if that's okay. I don't know if you were not expecting that. To particularly talk about some of the work we've been doing, and particularly the APPG inquiry that hopefully we would like to be taking forward and doing more work on. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting to go first, but that's perfectly fine. My name is Lloyd Russell-Moyle. I'm the Member of Parliament for Brighton and Kent Town. I first kind of got involved in Kurdish issues when I was a councillor, and the Sussex Kurdish community invited me along to the New Year's celebrations. Then Ibrahim roped me into going to, with Simon and a delegation from Unite to, first of all, northern Iraq, South Kurdistan, and then to Rojava. One of the things that we went to Rojava twice. I won't talk about that part too much, I'm sure others can pick up on that. But one of the things which was clear in the geopolitics of the situation of Rojava, where there was in my view, a new form of democracy being experimented, one that is bottom up, one that doesn't aim to destroy sovereign states, but one that aims to just work around them in a new and different way by creating local and creating international networks. And yes, you have whatever state you have there, but you work around it to say actually it is that local politics that is important, it is that solidarity, it is that democratic confederalism. And actually the real enemy of democratic confederalism at that point was not really Syria. It was not actually necessarily even Syria's ally in Russia or the NATO allies, but actually more broadly, but one particular so-called NATO ally, Turkey, that had taken in particular dislike to any idea of Kurdish self-determination on its border. And whilst they could cope with some deals that they could make with KRG, even that is a fragile relationship. And I'm sure some people will talk about some of the drone attacks that are ongoing and the attacks that are ongoing there. But there was a real danger that Turkey was pushing NATO to not only withdraw but allow them to push in to Rojava and to destroy the project. And to understand why Turkey had that motivation, because quite frankly, the SDF and the Rojavans, the Kurds, leading but not exclusively Kurdish, had done something that was positive for all of humanity and potentially should, in a rational sense, be positive for Turkey, which was to defeat ISIS and was to try and reform some sort of resemblance of society and rebuild it. And so to understand why Turkey was so hostile to that, I felt that we had to understand the political situation of Kurdish representation and equality in Turkey. 3 years prior, a number of MPs had gone and visited some of the trials of Kurdish political leaders in Turkey. Again, I'm sure Simon and others can talk about that experience. But things had got significantly worse even. Erdogan, the president, had been pushed even further right, partly because of his coalition with the MHP, partly because of the supposed coup. When I say supposed coup, I think it's a complicated picture about actually what happened there. But also, we had seen one of our sister parties, the HDP. We have 2 sister parties in Turkey, the CHP and the HDP. Broadly, the CHP is the traditional party of Turkey, and the MHP is the more left-wing radical party. I think it's the only party in the world that I know that has an LGBT list as well as a gender list. Remarkable for the region, let alone for the world, let alone for the region. And they were, our view was they would be routinely persecuted. I mean, in Hove we have a colleague who was an HDP MP, came to the UK to visit, and his citizenship was removed. And that was not an unusual form of activity. In my constituency, I've got a young HDP activist, was on the HDP Youth Committee, is now here and had to claim asylum after being tortured. And so these were not just affecting what I'd seen in Syria, but it was actually starting to affect people who were here in Brighton, people who were having to flee discrimination. So we launched this political representation and equality in Turkey inquiries. Myself and Crispin Blunt, who is the Conservative MP for Reigate and Redhill, I think that's his official title. But he had been a minister and had been the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, so he was a senior person from the Conservative side. Myself and a number of other Labour and Conservative MPs went about hearing evidence, and we looked at a number of areas, particularly around let me just get to the parliamentary representation. We looked around community, linguistic and cultural repression that is ongoing, gender-based oppression. Now that was something that is very interesting, not only because the Kurds and the HDP have a very strict gender equality policy, but at the same time Turkey had decided to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention against violence and discrimination for women. And so there was a particular aspect that, of course, if the HDP have 50% of women MPs in Parliament, and there is a clampdown more broadly against women, it disproportionately affects HDP members, HDP activists, HDP mayors, because they are not disproportionately in terms of population, they are proportional according to population, but compared to other parties, they have a much higher proportion, an equal proportion of women. And so actually the gender angle there was quite important to to understand generalised gender discrimination in Turkey, how was having an effect of more specific gender discrimination against Kurdish communities, freedom of the press, and then finally, which Jan will come on to, we heard evidence from himself and others around the status of the PKK. And the reason that was an important part to touch on was not because, we can have an argument about whether the PKK is still a terrorist organisation or not, or ever was a terrorist organisation. The UK currently still says it is. But the problem is Turkey is using that as a more expansive classification. So Jan will talk about whether it was terrorist or not, and I don't necessarily touch on that. But what the government was doing is making, the Turkish government was pushing Britain and other countries to expand that. So it meant they would say they share the ideals of the PKK. What they meant by that is they shared the ideals that there should be some self-autonomy for Kurdish people. They didn't share the methods of the PKK. They didn't necessarily share violent methods. These were people sometimes that were just advocating self-determination, advocating political representation, in some cases very explicitly advocating peaceful solutions. But what would happen is Turkey was putting pressure on Western allies in particular to say you need to arrest and try these people for terrorism charges because they've got links to the PKK because they share a view or they've had a meeting, etc. And that, our view, is a very dangerous expansion. The British government had already made a distinction between the PKK and the YPG-YPJ to say that engagement in northeastern Syria was not automatically terrorist, although there are that has not stopped some cases going to court CPS. But they had said in previous Foreign Office inquiry reports that they didn't regard the YPG-YPJ as automatically on the terrorist list. So they'd already made some distinction, and so we pushed them in the report to make a clearer distinction. We asked them to review the listing in its entirety, but actually to make clearer distinctions on what you are listing and what you are not. Because the expansive understanding is, of course, as you I'm sure will understand, a very chilling effect on democracy, because it basically says you can't speak out. And going back to the first chapter, that's actually what was happening in Turkey itself. So not only were HDP MPs being subject to this, and what was happening is their immunity was being stripped, and almost it was 100 MPs in total in Parliament had their immunity stripped or prepared to be stripped. But you were seeing that expand to CHP MPs. Now, the CHP party, our other sister party, is not known for being a hugely pro-Kurdish party. It is really an Ataturk kind of party. But even there, where they were some of their MPs were being more balanced, or were talking about the need actually to stop some of the violence that Turkey had done, including curfews, including the removal of mayors, including the cutting off of whole towns and villages against numerous international conventions. CHP members were speaking out against that, and they were then finding their parliamentary immunity stripped, and they were threatened of being charged to be kicked out of the parliament as well. So it was a dangerous, expansive move that looked like it was pushing, Turkey was heading towards a more oppressive, totalitarian and maybe dictatorial regime. Some people would call it a neo-Ottoman, but that I suspect is another question. That's what we looked at. We produced many recommendations. There are some reports that you can have a look at that are around. There's a box at the back here that I'm sure that you can grab if you're desperate for that, but they're online as well. The government have responded. Of course, the government have only just responded on the PKK parts in a very bland letter. We have applied for parliamentary debate, and there will be a 90-minute debate now on the second Tuesday we are back. No, the third Tuesday we are back, which is when the Foreign Office. And so we hope there to draw out some of these issues from the government, because the Minister will be forced to respond to the points that we raised at that moment. And we hope through that it sets precedents that we are able to use for the CPS when they are looking to expand and prosecute, but also on an international level where Turkey is supposedly our, I'll finish it, Turkey is supposedly our ally. And my view is that with your ally you have a greater duty to speak up, not a lesser duty.
Yes.
When someone is not your ally, when someone is not your friend, yes, you can condemn them and tick them off, but it has far less weight and it is far less important. And I put this in this kind of analogy, flippant it might be. If you see a stranger walking down the street and they wolf whistle a woman, you probably have a duty to say to that woman, I'm really sorry that that's happened. You probably have a duty, maybe, if you can, to make some comment to that stranger, but you probably don't get full head in the argument. If you're walking down the street and your best friend that you're walking with makes an inappropriate comment to a woman or wolf whistles them, you've got a duty to say to your friend, hey mate, that was totally out of order. I can't be your friend if you keep doing that. That's disgraceful. Your duty to intervene when they are your friend is higher than when they are not. And far too often what happens is we are obsessed with condemning our enemies and not actually pointing out our friends' failures. And that's why I think this is important in Turkey.
I'm going to try and whiz through everyone who... No, we did start a little bit late, but I am going to try and whiz through everyone. But I do want to say, sadly, he could have joined us today, but Hisham Özsoy, who's a HDP MP, was going to join us. He couldn't be here physically for various other programme reasons, and also couldn't join us today due to technical reasons. But you know, a lot of the things he would have said are also in this report. We do have plenty of copies, so feel free to take them. But also, very quickly, we have a Roger Information Centre report, which is called Beyond the Front Lines, which talks a bit about the system, the alternative system that is being built in north and east Syria, which will be crucial. We also have a small brochure which is outlines it a bit more practically and materially some of the work that can be done, and also why UK lawmakers must support the Kurdish movement, so please. And again, I just want to reiterate that when this debate happens, we will also write to all MPs, so please keep an eye out for that. And also please urge your MPs to join this debate and make some positive contributions in furthering the discussion around it. Without further ado, I do want to hand over to Jan, who will expand a bit more about some of the legal situations. And this is particularly why we wanted him today, because this fringe is titled Self-Determination, Freedom and Democracy. And one, of course, all of these matters are interconnected. Self-determination or freedom or democracy cannot happen on their own. They must be interlinked. But also, often, particularly in struggles fighting for freedom and self-determination, in kind of more micro ways, the law is thrown at people fighting for this often. And I think it's also important to understand that law, and actually sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we can also use that law in our favour. So yeah.
Thank you, Elif. When you announced there is a program for a 2 days conference, so I will stick to something slightly less ambitious. Actually, I would like to comment for you and inform you about a recent court decision in Belgium, which I think is important in the struggle against criminalization of the Kurdish movement and of the solidarity movement. As you know, the last 2-3 decades, European countries have been, all European countries, the United States, have all been engaged in criminalization of activities of Kurdish activist organizations, solidarity movements, under the umbrella of the anti-terrorist law. Pretending that PKK controls the Kurdish organizations, that PKK is a terrorist organization, and that therefore activities of, including solidarity activities, were problematic. And so I think a Belgian court took recently a decision which might open a new perspective, because for 20, 30 years we have been stuck in a situation which didn't move at all, where it seemed that there was no perspective of changing this, and that PKK was and would forever be on the terrorist list, and would and and was and would forever be considered as a terrorist organization. Now, first of all, I need to make one clarification for you on the legal point. Anti-terrorist laws in Europe actually have two branches. The first one is the administrative preventive branch, where assets freezing lists, banning of organizations, etc., is under this first branch. These are mainly actions of the executive power. Government is taking decisions, government establishes lists, government bans organizations or freezes assets. The second type of action, anti-terrorist action, of which Kurdish activists suffered in Europe, is actually repressive action, criminal law being applied, anti-terrorist criminal law being applied to them. And the case in Belgium is precisely, has to be situated in this second branch. It was criminal prosecution against Kurdish activists that was undertaken. In a decision taken by the Brussels Appeal Court on the 8th of March 2019, which was later upheld by the Supreme Court, by the Court of Cassation in January 2020, in essence, the Appeal Court said anti-terrorist criminal law does not apply to PKK, does not apply to those associated with PKK in some way, because PKK is not a terrorist organization. PKK is a party to an armed conflict with the Turkish state, an armed conflict as it is defined by international law, which is a very different matter. Terrorism, or being part of a civil war, because actually an internal armed conflict between a state actor and a non-state actor is of course a civil war. From a legal point of view, it's two totally different situations. This decision actually is the result of an investigation that started in 2008 in very special circumstances. And I think it's very interesting to have a detailed look at that, because initially the Turkish government was pressing the Belgian government to prosecute the representatives of the Kurdish movement in Brussels, the people in the Kurdish National Congress, the people that are running the Kurdish television in Brussels, etc. They were pressing them to prosecute these individuals. And the Belgian government was very reluctant, because they actually said these people, they are in fact only using their freedom of expression. So we can't prosecute them for freedom of expression is not a criminal activity. And the Turkish delegations that were sent to Brussels started to understand that it was not going to work. And so if you are in this kind of situation, what do you do? Well, you call your bigger brother to impress the government. That's actually what they did. And the US anti-terrorist coordinator in the US embassy in Brussels started organizing meetings with the Turkish delegation and the Belgian representatives. Three very high-ranking levels, very high-level delegations, US delegations, came to Brussels to pressure the Belgian authorities to prosecute the Kurdish representatives in Brussels. And so, actually, the Belgian government yielded to that, or the Belgian authorities yielded to that. And an investigation was started in 2008. It was a very broad investigation, which developed over 10 years. And at the end, it included not only the Kurdish National Congress, the representatives of the Kurdish television, but also the Syrian Kurds, the Iranian Kurds present in Brussels, the cultural associations, etc. And the prosecution developed the theory that all this was under the PKK umbrella or part of the PKK cloud. And finally, at the end of the investigations, 40 individuals and two media companies, were indicted and prosecuted for leadership of a terrorist organization or for participation in the activities of a terrorist organization. The concrete activities were recruiting, financing, and making propaganda. Of course, especially the media branch, it was about propaganda. The Brussels Appeal Court dismissed that prosecution after 10 years of investigation on the basis of a legal discussion, not on the basis of a lack of evidence, not on the basis of a technicality, but on the basis that anti-terrorist laws are not applicable to parties in an armed conflict. That principle is enshrined in the Belgian Criminal Code in Article 141 bis, but it's actually not a Belgian exotism. It's a principle that is enshrined in international law. All international anti-terrorist treaties, all but one, the Treaty on Financing, have this principle laid down in a provision. The principle that anti-terrorist laws cannot apply to a situation of war. In a situation of war, the laws of war apply, not the laws of anti-terrorism. And it's also laid down in the European Instruments on Terrorism. The directive, which of course is now not applicable anymore in the UK, thanks to Brexit, but which was applicable actually for a long time. The origin of this principle laid down in international law that you can't apply anti-terrorist law in a situation of armed conflict, of civil war, was actually for the first time discussed during the preparatory discussions of the Treaty on Terrorist Attacks with Explosives in 1997. And the problem there was that if you lay down that an attack with explosives is a terrorist offense, then it means that any act of war committed by state forces is an act of terrorism. And so the states said, yeah, we can't do that because we can't sign a treaty saying that any act of war we commit is an act of terrorism. So we have to find a way out of that. And they first discussed a provision which said state forces are not subject to anti-terrorist law. But then the Red Cross came in, the International Red Cross came in and said, we have a problem there. Because if you do this, then you create in a civil war total inequality between, on one hand, the state forces, who will be able to use whatever they want, as long as it is in a legitimate act of war, and whatever the non-state force will do will remain a criminal act and will be criminalized under the criminal law. So you can't do that. You can't create this kind of unequal situation in international law. When parties are warring, when parties are conducting a war, even a civil war, they have to be on some kind of balance. And so that is why the provision was included from then on in all anti-terrorist treaties that anti-terrorist laws do not apply to situations of war, whether it's an international war or an internal war. There are two criteria for this to determine whether it is a war, whether it is really a situation of war. One is the intensity of the conflict, and the second criterion is whether the non-state party has a sufficient degree of organization to be able to behave as an army and to apply international humanitarian law in the conflict. And so we extensively argued in the Belgian courts that PKK, that first of all the intensity of the conflict between the Kurds and the Turkish state did meet this criterion of intensity. And secondly, we also argued that the PKK and the HPG, the armed forces of PKK, were sufficiently organized and were sufficiently structured to behave as a party in war. And so that the court accepted our argument on this question. Now, let me conclude on what I think could be the consequences of this decision. First of all, I think it's a good decision because it is a confirmation and a consolidation of well-established principles of international law. It's not a decision that is out of order. It's not a decision that goes against international law. On the contrary, it's a decision that applies international law in a correct way to situations where the countries are facing both, sometimes civil wars, and on the other hand, terrorist acts. And so the distinction that was made initially, which made sense, is again re-established after a period where where actually anti-terrorism law dominated everything. And so this rebalances that situation in international. It doesn't lead to impunity. One of the arguments of the prosecution was that if you let PKK go, if you don't apply anti-terrorist law to PKK, then there will be impunity. But that is absolutely false. There is no impunity, because if PKK uses armed violence against non-combatants, against civil populations, well, PKK and the leaders of PKK will be liable under international humanitarian law for having committed war crimes. The difference is that the unequal situation where the Turkish authorities the Turkish armed forces could do whatever they want, and were anyhow not prosecuted, and where on the other hand, any act of the Kurdish forces in the civil war was considered as a criminal act. That situation is again balanced, because now the same laws, the same international humanitarian laws, the same definition of war crimes applies to the two parties, and they can both be prosecuted for war crimes. 3, it creates security for the solidarity movement, because previously, when you collected money for a Kurdish cause, or when you spoke out in favor of a Kurdish cause, or when you helped some initiative, you could always be in danger of being prosecuted for participating in the activity of a terrorist organization. And that is now, at least in Belgium, it's finished. Now the full respect for the freedom of expression and organization of the Kurdish community, but also of the solidarity movement, is re-established. And last but not least, and I will end on that, I think this creates much better perspectives for peace and for third countries to provide good offices in a process of establishing peace. Because I think if you consider the problem between Kurds and Turks as a conflict, an armed conflict, well, conflicts ought to be solved. If you consider it as terrorism, you have to crush it. Because terrorism, of course, you can't solve it, you have to fight it. And so the shift from an approach under anti-terrorist law, where actually the only option you have is to try to stop it by all possible means and to suppress it, to an approach based on the fact that this is a conflict that needs to be solved, I think opens a really very large number of possibilities, a very broad range of possibilities for European countries to intervene in a positive way in this situation. And to weigh on Turkey, to bring them to the negotiation table back again, and to try to find a negotiated solution with the Kurds. There is a lot more to say, and of course I'm available for anybody who would like more information, concrete information about the case. But of course we have a very limited time, and so I think this is more than
as we said, copies of the APPG report and other material we do have available, and we have Matt and Ida who is standing up, who can certainly give it to you. I mean, thank you very much. I think no one else could have done that in that kind of time. So thank you very much for that, Jan. And honestly, I think someday, particularly the process of this case, it ought to be made into a movie, because the details are actually mind-blowing. But I do want some time for questions, but we have our MPs here as well. So I want to, just perhaps in that order, Bambos, Kim, and then Kate, for you to say a few words each. And I also just want to, before that, to remind now that on Tuesday the 28th of September from 12:30 to 2, the Freedom for Öcalan and Unite Fringe will be in the consort room in the Grand Hotel. So that's on Tuesday from 12:30 to 2. Hishad Özsoy will be joining online there. So sadly we couldn't have him join today, but if you want to hear more about the situation of the HDP, please come along to that. It will certainly be a very important session. But without further ado, Bambos.
I'll be brief because I won't allow time for questions, but it was a real pleasure to be on the APPG and to hear evidence from Jan and from other amazing witnesses, including the mayors who were exiled by Turkey. And there were some great recommendations in the report. I first got involved with the APPG because I have a big Kurdish community in Enfield, and I very much show solidarity with them in supporting them in this cause. And what's happening in Turkey and about the way that the HDP and other politicians are being treated and silenced by Erdogan is really truly shocking, and more people need to be made aware of that. I got involved with the hunger strike that Leyla Güven and other hunger strikers were forced to raise the issue about Abdullah Öcalan being held in solitary, and the need that also needs to be resolved. So I very much have solidarity with you. The report is an excellent start, but we need to put pressure on the UK government to do much more than it's doing, because it's not doing anywhere near enough to put pressure on Turkey to allow the freedoms and allow the HDP and political freedoms across the board. So if you get the chance to do read the report, it's an excellent report. It was both a joy but also very harrowing to hear what was heard in the open sessions of the APPG. But it's a start, and we will push ahead, and I'll work with Lloyd and other parliamentarians to make sure that your voices are heard in Parliament.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, comrades. I'm the MP for Liverpool Riverside, and we are a city of sanctuary, and we provide refuge for people fleeing humanitarian crisis. And I'm really pleased that you has invited me to this meeting today. I'm really pleased to offer my solidarity and support to the Kurdish people who have shown such strength and resilience in their resistance and struggle for liberation and autonomy, and a commitment to building a revolutionary society founded in the grassroots democracy, ecology and gender equality. The fact that Erdogan is still imprisoned on Imran Island is without basic rights is nothing short of an outrage, and I reiterate what Bambos has said, that we as a party and the government needs to do a lot more. But I am proud that the UK Labour movement stands resolutely with the Kurdish people and will continue to fight for our government, and especially the EU, to take a decisive action to end the mistreatment of the Kurdish community and ensure the release of all political prisoners, including Öcalan, and make serious progress with peace, with the peace process. So solidarity to the Kurdish people, and you have my full solidarity.
Thank you so much for that, Kim. And Kim?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I just need to okay. No, that's okay. That's better. I can hear myself more now. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. Before I became an MP, I was very active in my union Unite, in the international work that Unite do, working alongside Simon here, and through that was introduced to the Kurdish political movement and the fight for justice, freedom, equality, democracy and self-determination, as well as, of course, the campaign to free Abdullah Öcalan, who has been said has been in jail in near total isolation for over 22 years against international and Turkish domestic law. So Öcalan's ideas, penned whilst in prison, have given not just the Kurds but all of us a glimpse into what true freedom, democracy and equality in society could look like. And of course we've seen the start of such a society in Rojava in north and east Syria. Öcalan's values of women's liberation, equality across all ethnicities, grassroots democracy and social justice are values that we all here hold as well. And these values, however, are not the values of President Erdogan of Turkey, and we are seeing his government making huge attempts to eradicate any of these ideas taking root in not just Turkish civil society, but across its borders into Rojava. And we know that extreme repression and the decline of democracy has been a concern in Turkey. Tens of thousands of journalists, trade unionists, teachers, opposition, politicians, human rights activists, women's activists, and countless others have been jailed or dismissed from their jobs. And there is deep political polarisation, social turmoil, and economic instability. And we're also seeing an outrageous war being waged against the Kurdish population, both within Turkey's borders and across the borders into Syria and Iraq. As things stand, President Erdogan and his far-right regime are engaged in a campaign of annihilation against the main opposition party, one of Labour's sister parties, the socially progressive People's Democratic Party, the HDP, which is, as we all know, majority Kurdish. HDP activists and politicians have been arrested under the guise of being of belonging to a terrorist organisation or promotion of a terrorist group, and it has led to the party's leaders all receiving lengthy prison sentences and democratically elected MPs and local politicians arrested and replaced with the government's appointed trustees. And of course, there was a horrific murder in June this year of HDP member Denise Poyraz by a far-right assailant who had links with the ultra-nationalist group, the Grey Wolves. The building she was in was being watched by police, yet the attacker was able to walk in and carry out his attack with ease. The Öcalan government has created such an atmosphere of hate against the Kurds that attacks like this are able to happen with impunity. In civil society, the Öcalan regime has ramped up the erosion of women's legal and social rights, with the country pulling out of the Istanbul Convention, as Lloyd mentioned earlier this year, being a real reminder to the international community on the sharp decline Turkey has taken on women's rights. Many women politicians and trade union activists have been terrorised for defending basic human rights. Women have faced abuse and violence, often by uniformed authorities, and disappearances by the police are commonplace. Non-governmental organisations, including women's groups and human rights organisations, have been closed by the authorities in the country. This attitude to women in society is in deep contrast to that of women in the Kurdish political movement, where we see women participating fully across all of society, and is actually a system that we ourselves can learn from. The LGBT community has also come under threat from the authoritarian policies of President Erdogan. The country's justice system is systematically used to criminalise peaceful activities such as pride events and art exhibitions. And trade unionists too are under constant attack, facing both administrative and judicial harassment for carrying out legitimate trade union activities. Workers who dare to exercise their democratic right to protest in the country are often arrested and sent to trial on bogus anti-terror legislation. The use of so-called anti-terror laws by Turkey against the Kurds, and in fact against any opposition, or the excuse that Turkey needs to defend itself against terrorism, has meant Turkey has been able to act with impunity against those who oppose its decline of democracy and those who want peace, equality and freedom. We know that this Tory government has been complicit in Turkey's war on Kurds through its continued sale of arms. In December last year, the UK government signed a trade agreement with the government of Turkey that contains no enforceable commitments for Turkey to respect labour or human rights. And I was grateful that my colleague, Ferriol Clark, who I think was hoping to be with us and unfortunately can't, she led a Westminster Hall debate earlier this year where we were able to call on the UK government to take a much firmer line against Turkey's continued human rights and workers' rights violations, both within and outside its own borders. And I took part in that debate, and I called on the UK government to do all they can to push the Turkish government to work towards protecting fundamental minority rights in the country and to make it a requirement of the government of Turkey to show respect for core international labour organisation conventions. And I urge the UK government to commit to suspending the UK-Turkey trade deal should the Turkish government implement their threatened ban on the HDP. Socialists who believe in the fight for peace and justice should be extremely concerned about the way Turkey, a UK ally, has been said, is becoming a one-party, one religion, one ideology state. We cannot allow this Tory government to turn a blind eye on human rights violations carried out by repressive authoritarian governments such as this. I will continue to use my platform in Parliament to speak out on these injustices, and we, as a party, must do all we can to show solidarity with our Kurdish brothers and sisters and support them in their fight for self-determination, freedom and democracy in the countries where they live. And we should join the international call, and I hope people do join Unite's fringe event in relation to the fight for the freedom of Öcalan. Thank you very much.
Last but certainly not least, we're going to have a few words from Simon, but just very briefly before that, I really want to take this opportunity to publicly thank Unite the Union and GMB for founding the Freedom for Öcalan campaign in 2016 and for their continued support. He has had to leave early, but I also want to acknowledge that Tommy Murphy of Unite was also with us today, and also has been very strong and continued supporters of the Freedom for Öcalan campaign, and also the fight for Kurdish self-determination. Also, Ferial did really want to be with us today, but she is still on maternity leave, so could not be with us today. She has sent a message. We don't actually have time to read it all, but we will share it on social media, and you can follow the Kurdish Assembly on @KurdishAssembly. So yeah, last but not least, Simon.
Look, thank you, Elif. I should be really brief. I've done so many international meetings where somebody begins by saying, I'm going to be brief, and then 15 minutes later they're still talking, but I will definitely try. Look, first of all, I do want to say thanks, especially for the work of Jan in that real groundbreaking case, in the work of Lloyd and Bambus and others in the APPG, in the words of solidarity. I think it's absolutely brilliant, and we're moving definitely in a much better direction. But look, we were talking generally, the title of the Fringe was about the situation of Kurds generally in self-determination. Middle East is a critical region. It always will be. Of course, oil elevated it, but even after the oil's gone, it will always be the crossroads, and it's always going to be a crucial area. Our principles of our movement, democracy, inclusiveness, tolerance, winning, those are the values of the Kurdish political movement. The Middle East has never been so dangerous as it is at the moment. It is at explosion point. We've been listening about Turkey and other areas and repression. So in those situations, it's vital. We need to work with our friends, the people that share our values. There will be no peace and stability and democracy in the Middle East if the Kurds do not have their freedom. So it's absolutely vital that we reinforce that. Quickly look at the map. I think the situation in Iraq in many ways is better. It's not perfect, there's massive problems, the Barzani family and everything, but it's better than it was under the situation with Hussein, despite the pressures. In Turkey, there was huge progress for a period, and then it got smashed up again with all the comments we've heard about Erdogan, the repression. In Syria, I think the position of Kurds and all peoples in that region took a sharp turn for the improvement in those few years, and now they're attacking it and trying to smash it up again. Iran, no real progress in many ways, a lot more repression. But if you stand back and look, there's been progress. It's not all doom and gloom, but they are under massive pressure, and we need to rebuild and strengthen that solidarity. Resilience is a mark of Kurdish people almost wherever they are because of the oppression they've always faced. I don't think it's a coincidence that there's the expression resistance is life, because the whole life of the Kurdish people has been about resisting oppression and trying to fight for their freedom. So as Elif mentioned, we debated and talked about it a lot. How do we do it? It's culturally further away for a lot of people. A lot of people don't see the relevance to them directly. We believe Freedom for Öcalan was the way to approach that. That's the force, those are the movements that really unite the progressive forces. We need to get people to understand the man's been in isolation for over 20 years. That is a definition of torture by any standards. He needs to be released. Only with the release can we hope to restart and see a new peace process in Turkey, and if for it to move in the right direction. But around that agenda, we've got to build our solidarity. Our campaign's grown hugely and quickly. 16 unions are in it now. It's the position of the TUC. We've got to drive it further in the Labour Party and further afield. So let's get on with trying to do that, and please join us if you can.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. I think it's, this shows that practice does make perfect. It was an incredible way to very briefly outline some of the work that has been happening and some of the work that we would like to do. I think we're going to take a few questions, but I also want to just put it out there that we quite intentionally and deliberately didn't want to make this fringe meeting like, kind of like a news briefing in terms of, what's been happening lately and so on. That's obviously crucial, but I do want to say we will be sending out news, the Kurdish Assembly will be sending out regular news briefings, so if you also do want to join that list, please speak to Mal Arida, who will add you to that list. But I also want to publicly thank Bambos, Kim, Lloyd, Kate, particularly as parliamentarians, but of course Simon and Jan for their continued support and solidarity. It really, really, really is crucial. And I think it really also has been shown and demonstrated today that what we're trying to do, what we're talking about, and what we're fighting for, isn't just about the freedom of the Kurdish people, although of course very crucial and central, but actually that freedom means a whole lot for the entire region and actually perhaps for the whole world. And that's really crucial to understand that connection. Again, I wish we had hours and hours where we can talk about the history and the division of Kurdistan 100 years ago and so on, and what that means. And perhaps we will have sessions where we discuss those in more of an educational way. But I think it's really crucial while we're learning about the situation to also be taking action exactly at the same time. And so I think I just want to remind everyone to join the Freedom for Öcalan Fringe on Tuesday the 28th of September from 12:30 to 2 in the consort room in the Grand Hotel. There will be a bit more discussion there. Of course, speak to us, contact us, urge your MPs to join the debate that Lloyd was talking about, but also anyone, whether it's Hishad or Jan, as he said himself, any of us, myself, we are happy to join any meeting, any branch meeting, any CLP, whatever meetings that may be happening, to also talk about the situation, to also further that understanding and that awareness. So get in touch with us. I think we have probably realistically have time for about 3 questions, and I'll take them all in one go. If possible, please, ask a specific person a question. If not, of course, we'll see who would like to answer the questions. So, are there any questions? So 1, 2. Sure. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. 1, 2. Any other? Okay, so we have 2 questions. What's your name? Inan. Okay, and this
Question for Jan. How does the judgment from Belgium affect other European countries like Germany?
Okay, maybe let's take the other one as well.
What effect would greater autonomy for Kurds in other parts of the world, for example Iraq or Syria, have on Kurds in Turkey? And how would that help or hinder the cause in Turkey? I'm not sure who would want to answer that, but yeah.
Okay. So obviously there was a question towards Jan. That question I will very briefly try and answer it, but if I can't, please come on Tuesday. There will be more of a discussion then. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Of course,
a Belgian court decision doesn't set a precedent in Germany. No? Let's be very clear. But, there is a but. First of all, the principles on which this, principles of international law on which this decision is founded are applicable in all countries that actually signed the Geneva Conventions and that signed the subsequent treaties on terrorism. And so the principles should be applied in Germany, in the UK, in France, in all these countries. The international legal framework that is applied here and on which the decision is based is the same in all these countries. Now, of course, when we started this case, let's be very clear, we started pleading this case in 2014 after the investigation was completed. We raised the argument, but we were absolutely convinced that never ever we would get a positive decision on this. Because we were also mentally in the climate where everything always went in the same direction, where the criminalization was a fact, etc. And so we were to some extent surprised ourselves that suddenly a Belgian court said, hey, wait a moment, we have a complicated situation here. We have a situation where we just can't rush into a decision about PKK being a terrorist organization. So I think we should try to use this as a lever to start the discussion in other countries and to say, okay, the Belgians, it's not because the Belgians are weird, exotic people that they took this decision. It's not because Belgian judges are a little bit crazy. It's because they applied principles of international law, which are actually binding on all these other countries. So let's try to have a look at what they did and why they did this. And if we find that this is indeed in line with international law, we should maybe think about going down the same road. And I think so. We have to use it to open doors. We have to use it to open doors in the struggle against criminalization. And I think the fact that it's actually based on international law, on principles of international law, although they were transposed into Belgian law, actually the principle of international law was explicitly mentioned in the Belgian law. That doesn't change anything to the fact that it's a principle of international law. And that it applies also when it's not explicitly mentioned in your own criminal law. Countries are bound by the principles of international law once they sign the treaties in which these principles are laid down. So I think it should have an effect. We have to work so that we have to continue to work so that it does have an effect and it does trigger discussions in other countries. But of course, that is work in progress, and it's not automatically that because the Belgian court said that is a precedent in other courts. Hoping that answered your question.
I think the other thing that I'm not sure has been mentioned much today is the parallel court process in the European Court of Justice. So the European Union lists every year, it reissues the list of terrorist prescribed organisations. That list can be challenged by going through the court process. Of course, by the time you go through the court process, you're challenging a list from 2019, and it's already 2021, and a new list has been produced. So there has been a court case in Luxembourg, where the European Court of Justice is, which has provisionally decided that the listings, I can't remember the dates, but the listings
2014 to
2014 to 18 are non-compliant, and therefore the PKK is not listed in those years under European law. The problem is you have to go back and then get another hearing in a case. Now, presumably each case gets quicker as the law is tried and tested, but it doesn't necessarily become as quick as soon as it's out, you can challenge it. What will happen in time eventually, one assumes, is that politicians and governments will stop putting it in a list because it becomes a farcical situation of getting it removed every time, and further action could be taken. But that also has application then in Britain. Britain does its listing system slightly differently, we don't produce an annual list. We have two kinds of lists. One which the Parliament will have voted on. The Parliament has not voted directly about the PKK. The Parliament has voted directly on Hamas. I think we voted directly on. I think we voted directly on a few other organisations, but we have not. So the PKK is listed because the Secretary of State lists it themselves, and that therefore is open for judicial review if a case can be found. So there is an opening there using the basis of European law, which was incorporated into British law. We haven't yet deviated from it, even though we can't be bound by the European courts. A British court is allowed to take those principles. Well, it can take the principles of any international court, as we've heard, but it can directly apply principles from a European court when we've not deviated from that law as currently stands, and we've not yet deviated from that law. So there are some interesting legal principles there. As with all things, it requires a case to push against it, and unless a case comes forward that works to push against it, it will be one of these unknown legal quantities until such time as we get there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's one more question, and then I will also try and answer your question.
Sorry. Right now we're in a room filled with people who obviously care about supporting Kurdish people, but I wonder how many of us are actually going to leave this room and do some work or intend to work to actually help the Kurdish people. What can each of us individually do to help this cause?
Thank you very much. I'll try and... Would you like to come on that?
So, well, the point is to actually change the government's attitude about these things. We converted, we support you, but many people, many parliamentarians probably aren't aware of the issue or don't care so much because it's not high up on their agenda. So the thing is to organise, contact parliamentarians who aren't here, who are from different parties, and make sure it's on their agenda. One language that MPs understand is their constituents, and about how important it is to respond to their constituents' concerns. So make sure you write letters, you meet your MPs, you lobby them, you make sure they attend debates like the one that Lloyd's organising. So make sure that you encourage them, not just from, the Kurdish community stretches far and wide. So much I think a lot of it is based in North London, it's much wider than that. So even if you have one person who is who lives in, Harrogate or Coventry or whatever, get them to write to their MP will have to respond to them. And it raises the issue, and the important thing is to get the issue up the agenda, make sure the MPs take action, make sure they listen to the cause, and that way you will get it up the agenda, and there's a greater chance of of us changing the government's mind. And so that's what I would do.
I think I would just reiterate what Bambas said. It's really important about raising the profile and listening to the voices of Kurdish people, because that's really important. And using every avenue that's available. So yeah.
I think we've heard that during the APPG, if you can, get your MP to do something, and get MPs to talk about it. I think that there is an important cultural element to this as well. So I think the fact that the Kurdish community invited me as a councillor, the Lord Mayor, to the New Year's celebration and continue to do that is an important thing as well, to do things that not just play on your political line, but your kind of heart. And I think if you can organise them, that would be great. I'll just, if you forgive me, just touch on, does greater autonomy help? I think it's a double-edged sword. I think, and it's a double-edged sword because the concept of greater autonomy is seen slightly differently in different parts of what we would call Greater Kurdistan. Generally, my understanding is in Rojava, northeastern Syria, there is not a determination for independence. There is a feeling that they want a democratic and federal structure where they would still be part of the whole of Syria, but have autonomy and democracy within it. And clearly in Iraq, in the KRG, there was a referendum for full independence that didn't that caused a political crisis. And the causing of that political crisis, of course, probably undermined some ability to readdress that issue soon. So it probably meant that question's now been put to bed for at least 20 years, a generation maybe. And so you can say moves can be progressive, but with all moves there is a reaction, and there's a danger that Turkey becomes fearful of greater autonomy and actually clamps down on its people in Turkey. Does that mean that you don't fight for your rights because there's a reaction? No, but it does mean that we need to sometimes be aware when we are supporting and showing solidarity that there are moments in change where there are pressure points where people can react badly, and we need to be resilient and understand that.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Yeah, I think that was a very crucial outlining, but I also want to add that, as we've heard today, and as probably a lot of us will know, the single greatest obstacle for a just and democratic Kurdish self-determination is NATO, but in the personage of the Turkish state. And that's really crucial to understand. I mean, one could go into and talk about the history of NATO and why that is so. But I think it's important to, and the reason why I say that is because there is a level of autonomy, for example, in South Kurdistan. But it's a version of autonomy that is quite comfortable. And for example, the governing body of the Kurdistan regional government has generally friendly relationships with Turkey, but even though there was that friendly relationship, I'm being diplomatic here, by the way, but even though there's those friendly relationships, when there was the independence referendum in Kurdistan, not that that's the project of the Kurdish movement, but when there was the independence of Kurdistan, again, the biggest voice against that was the Turkish state. And like I said, and I would like to reiterate, that is not what the Kurdish freedom movement is trying to achieve. That is particularly not the alternative of the Kurdish people's leader Abdullah Öcalan. But that's why even a relative level of autonomy in northeast Syria is seen as an existential threat by the Turkish state, an existential political threat. And actually it is, because the success of that alternative means that the Turkish state as a structure would have to fundamentally reorganize itself. And therefore, I do think actually it still comes down to, being a double-edged sword. But I think it's a really important question. I think it's a very deep question. But I think very briefly it's probably possible to answer it in that way. But of course it's a conversation for many, many times. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to Lloyd, thank you to Kate and Simon, who had to run off to other sessions because we've slightly overrun. Thank you, Jan, for coming all this way. Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Bambos, for your continued support. And actually, at times when it's seen essentially sometimes as a bit of a taboo, you were at the forefront of raising your voice, particularly when there was the hunger strike and like event. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. There are stuff to collect there. And again, I want to remind everyone on Tuesday, the Consort Room, Grand Hotel, 12:30 to 2. Thank you very much.